definitely Toussaint Louverture was a genius of a man. He was like I told you, he was the perfect storm. He was blessed with such wisdom and the capability of such diplomacy that he used diplomacy at times when many people would have gone and killed. So he never liked unnecessary bloodshed. So to go back to Toussaint, Toussaint also he in his youth and as a teenager, as in his 20s, 30s, he worked on a plantation, on the plantation of his owner, where he was in charge of all the animals there. So he was from his knowledge of herbs and things, so he could cure any animal that had any diseases. So he held that, and he also held. He was in charge of many people on the plantation, including being the chauffeur of the master. So he was trained in management. So at that time, when he held the position as a vet, basically as the vet of the plantation, that was a position usually held by a white man. So all this time, as you say, you right about Toussaint being strategic, because believe it or not, Toussaint did not enter the scene of the revolution until 1791.
Yes, that's right.
And there were revolts, there were slave revolts before that that were not successful. Let's just say that history also taught Toussaint about how you have to be really precise about your attack when you do have the revolution. So it will not fail, for they knew what the consequences were if a failed insurrection is not good for the slave. And Toussaint, so all of that happened. So when in 1791, when Toussaint realized, okay, because he was in the shadows, being strategic still, because he was
Mhm.
still working at the plantation of his master, Henri Duclos, and he was in the shadows, being calculating, because he did not want for him to start something, and it was not a success, because it will have been to the detriment of everybody, because Toussaint also capitalized on the fact that the big whites was fighting the small whites, you know. So there was also internal things. So the slave, us as slaves, benefited from that too. But Toussaint himself stayed in the shadows. In 1791, after the voodoo ceremony in Bois Caiman, my men came out. And from the beginning, from the first time they saw him, they knew he was that man. And he was reading also books about liberty, you know, how he knew about what was happening in France also.
Mhm.
And that's where he's one of the great individuals, man, that dealt with the French hypocrisy while they're screaming for liberté, égalité, fraternité in France. They wanted to enslave me in Haiti. You understand? So he knew all too well, man, to play with that hypocrisy, to make them to make them feel, yeah,
Mhm. Mhm.
we're gonna listen to you, but at the same time, you cannot be saying liberty, equality, fraternity for you and your people, and you come and you want me to make a slave out of me. But as you can tell, it was all monetarily driven. It was all about money. It was about having that sugar plantation in Haiti and be a noble in Paris. You know what I mean? So
Exactly.
if you had slaves in Haiti working the land, sugarcane, cocoa, coffee, you could be a great noble in France. You be part of the of royalty and so on and so forth. You become part of that aristocracy. So Toussaint, like I told you, was the perfect storm, but strategically he entered in 1791. Okay, Toussaint also, many people do not know that Toussaint also had the ability to speak quite a few African languages,
Hmm.
because Toussaint there were many of our brothers who also were Muslim who spoke Arabic. Some of them spoke Wolof. Some of them spoke Mandingo. And Toussaint was the only man in town, man, that was able to speak, because there were many of these slaves that did not speak Creole. So Toussaint could communicate with them in their native tongue. And when they saw Toussaint mounted on a horse, they thought he was a god, and he spoke their language. So he had that going for him, because at that time there were many slaves were not allowed to really ride horses. So he was mounted on a horse and he spoke their language. They're like, wow, this guy is a person like me, and he is brilliant. And Toussaint, in many ways, was very calculating. I'm not saying that Toussaint did not engage he was a general. So he had to engage in the art of war and kill, because he was a soldier, and he was a soldier fighting for liberty. But he totally showed great control and leadership. He was very calm in many of his situations where somebody else might have snapped or committed mass genocide. He did not, but that doesn't mean he didn't do his thing,
Right.
But he did it. But he used diplomacy to the fullest of his capability until he could not use diplomacy anymore. Because the goal was a free republic. So that was the goal. In the name of, and Toussaint, totally, being the genius that he was, man, he rode that wave of the French Revolution. That you screaming liberté, égalité, fraternité in France, and you want to enslave me here. That same guy screaming liberty, égalité, fraternity, you want to enslave me in the Indies, So he also played in their conscience and kind of justify, if he fights for his freedom and he take up arms, it is his right, as it is their right in France to take up arms and go to the Bastille, and they start guillotining kings in the name of liberty, equality, fraternity. So if you're willing to kill for yours, I should be able to be willing to kill for mine. So Toussaint played all these roles also, and he one of the things about him also, people used to say that he could disappear, like he could go from north to south in the span of time. At that time was extremely incredible. He rode 125 miles every day on a horse. 125 miles. But you know what he did though? Because for me to describe him to you, his traits. He was not a big person. He was about 125 pounds to the max. He was not tall. He was not very handsome. But this dude knew that in order for him to do the things that he was doing, because he had to be on the move, because he was always afraid to be assassinated. So he did not eat from anybody. So so what he did, he bought the finest of horses, because he was a man that was trained in horses and animals. And so he had horses at different stations in different places. You can call it relays. So he will ride a horse for 50 miles. And then he had a place where he will replace his horse, get a fresh horse. So this dude used to travel from north to south, and people used to say, no, it is incredible, but this guy can ride 125 miles a day on a horse. In his body, he had the body of a jockey. He had the perfect body, and he was one of the greatest horse riders. Yes, a grand chevalier. They call him that. They call him the centaur of the Caribbean.
Ah.
He was part man, part horse.
That's very fitting. That's very fitting. And what I want to delve into